Hi everyone, and welcome to our week where you are going to be writing your theory and hypothesis. Okay, so for today, we're really just going to go over what needs to be in the theory and hypothesis section. Some of this will be a rehashing from last week, but I want for it to be super clear what is going to be expected of you with the submission this week. So just as a reminder, this is the rubric. So you should have good style, language, grammar, and citations, though I don't expect for you to have a lot of citations in this section. You are going to be including a transition paragraph away from your literature review, and at the beginning of this section, you're going to highlight the gap that your work is going to be filling. Then you are going to have a clear causal statement. That's just one sentence where you say, I think X causes Y. A clear, compelling, and detailed causal explanation, right? This is where you are supporting the causal statement and how X connects to Y. And then finally at the end is the clear and testable hypothesis. And this is probably the most important component of this whole section, because if you don't have a good hypothesis, then you can't test it and you can't move forward with your research paper. But each of these elements are worth 20 points for a total of 100 points. Now, to be clear, this is not a super long section. If you give me 3 single-spaced pages, that's too many. This is 1 to 2 double-spaced pages. This is not a super, super long submission, okay? So let me walk you through a few of the elements as well as your example from the reading. So what needs to be in this theory and hypothesis submission? So that first paragraph, as I just mentioned, needs to be that evaluation of schools of thought, right? Where you are highlighting your gap and you are transitioning away from your literature review. So this is a transition paragraph. Then the next paragraph is going to be your causal statement, which is just one sentence, and then an explanation, the because, right? Why you think X causes Y. And then you are going to have your hypothesis, which is one italicized sentence at the end. Okay, we're going to walk through an example here of these 3 elements. So evaluation of schools of thought, causal statement and explanation, and hypothesis. So for evaluating the schools of thought, this is paragraph 1. You are going to be starting by evaluating the schools of thought from your literature review. You've already done a bit of this already at the end of your literature review, but this time I want you to highlight it again, right? A lot of times these papers, if you're reading them all the way through, they are in some ways repetitive, and that's partially because people tend to skip around. But also it's important that you're highlighting how your work is filling a current gap in the scholarship, okay? So you want to be identifying where previous scholarship has fallen short and what gap you think should be further explored, right? What research are you going to be contributing here, right? You are highlighting what is missing from current scholarship. Yes, you can rehash the last paragraph from your literature review. So I expect these will probably be quite similar. Can you copy and paste them? No, please don't do that. That's very redundant. I'm saying it's repetitive, but I'm not saying it's the exact same. But you can mirror and rediscuss what you already discussed at the end of the literature review if you felt that that set you up in a really solid way for your theory and hypothesis section. This is your example from the Baglioni reading, right? The most useful approach for thinking about the 2011 uprisings in MENA seems to be the final media empower activists school. So they are saying here, like, this is the school of thought that I think is most useful to be talking about, right? This is the one that I'm going to be building from. Structural conditions like the balance of power, economic conditions, or even domestic structures seem to only account for so much. So they're saying, yes, these do matter in the scholarship, but they are not the primary thing that we think explains this instance. All countries in the world face the same global structural conditions, with American power eroding and democratic values sporadically ebbing and flowing. But for some reason, other regions did not erupt in demands for change. Similarly, poverty and demographic challenge faced countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Central Asia, in addition to the Arab states, but they remained stable, right? So they're saying, like, look, poverty and demographic challenges are not good enough. Like that, though that previous scholarship in the literature is not sufficient for explaining what happened in MENA, right? Activists, too, have been seeking to promote democratic change in various parts of the world with varying degrees of success, but they didn't succeed in MENA until there was a great confluence of technological developments, right? So they're saying, like, this gap is partially about technological developments. While domestic structures appear important in understanding why revolutions turn out as they do, they seem less to be able to predict when and why uprisings emerge, even in the case of 2011. As Lynch, 2012, explains, the rise of satellite TV and the unity that emerged as a result of the new Palestinian Intifada and the Iraq War, that these stations broadcast helped citizens of MENA believe they were interconnected. They also provided alternative sources of information from state propaganda. In addition, social media also undermined the official stories, helped citizens see that they were not alone in their dissatisfaction, and perhaps most important, gave activists and ordinary people an organizing tool. Together, the media and the people were most essential for challenging these regimes and account for the Arab Spring. Right? So they're saying, look, previous scholarship has primarily looked at structural conditions, demographic conditions, maybe activists' explanations, but none of those seem quite right. And instead, we should be looking at changes in technology, particularly around social media, maybe rise of satellite TV, this kind of thing. So this is like, they're evaluating those schools of thought again and saying, like, we are going with the media empower activists school. Okay. Now, what needs to appear in the next paragraph? So if the first paragraph is rehashing these schools of thought, the gap, and where you're going to be contributing, the next paragraph or two is causal statement and explanation. So the causal statement is which independent variable X causes your dependent variable Y. Okay. So you can use an arrow diagram or model, as Baglioni calls it. Then you're going to have, remember that causal statement is just one sentence, and we'll look at the Baglioni example in a second. And then the causal explanation is a paragraph. It's usually 3 to 5 sentences if you use the because, where you explain why X is connected to Y. So why your independent variable causes change in your dependent variable. So this section here is the rationale for the relationship that you're establishing with the causal statement. Okay, so this is a little bit abstract, but let's jump in to the Baglioni example really quickly. So non-official satellite television and social media helped revolutionize the atmosphere in the Middle East and North Africa by 2011. Okay, that is your causal statement, right? Non-official satellite TV and social media revolutionized the atmosphere in the Middle East and North Africa. That's the causal statement. With the regimes no longer controlling the airwaves and citizens having ways of communicating with one another outside of the state's control, activists could more explicitly state their grievances, galvanize support, and organize opposition to the regime. The effects of the media then were to free more citizens to more intensely challenge the regime, and enormous demonstrations ultimately led to the toppling of the longtime leaders. Without the media and the people in the streets, the authoritarians would not have given up. In simple terms, this argument can be understood as the level of citizen access to non-official, traditional, and social media increases the likelihood of the regime falling. Okay. So this is the causal statement here in this first sentence, and then the rest is the causal explanation, like a few sentences where you're outlining all of the ways in which you think the access to satellite TV and social media helped increase the likelihood that the regime was going to fall, right? And they say it's because they have new ways of communicating with one another outside of the state's control, that activists can more explicitly state their grievances, that it can galvanize support, and ultimately you can use these forms of media to organize opposition, right? So these remaining sentences are the causal explanation, okay? Causal statement, the first sentence, causal explanation, the next few sentences, okay? Now, the hypothesis is just one line, okay? You don't need a whole paragraph, it's just one line. I know the Baglioni example does have a whole paragraph or like a short paragraph, but you just need one italicized line. And just remember that this hypothesis needs to be testable, and it should meet the criteria of a good hypothesis. So it needs to be testable, right? That's the crux of this whole paper, is that you will be testing something. Okay, it needs to be empirical in nature, right? This can't be, the example from last week was like, democracy is the best form of government, right? That's not an empirical thing. That's not testable. This needs to be something that establishes a relationship between X and Y, right? It needs to be about creating that empirical relationship between the two. It also needs to be general. So it doesn't just apply to one instance, but could apply more broadly. So not to just the United States, but this theory could be applied more broadly. That's just an example. Okay. It also needs to be specific enough to where I could tell whether the relationship is positive or negative. Okay. It also should correspond to the way in which the researcher intends to test the hypothesis. And then finally, and really most importantly, it should imply the researcher's unit of analysis. So just as a refresher, you should be able to see whether it is a civil war, whether it is a country, whether you are looking at people, right? I should be able to tell as the reader which of these it is. And the example from Baglioni here is, in other words, the greater citizens' access to non-official traditional and social media, then the greater the likelihood the regime will fall. That is the hypothesis. And then she has a little bit more. The MENA revolution showed that the truth sets people free under authoritarian conditions, and tools to spread the truth, organize people, and bring them out on the streets in large numbers convince the repressive regime that it has no hope of holding on. So that's the basic crux, right? But again, you don't need this kind of sentence here. You can just end with the hypothesis. Okay, that is all, right? That is all you need to include for the submission. It should really have about 2 to maybe 3 paragraphs. It is not very long. Okay, if you have any questions, please feel free to come see me or email me. Either one is great. But yes, time to start writing.